Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler. I am a teacher and a fantasy novelist on my free time. I live in Munich in Bavaria. It's in the south of Germany. And I started this channel because I want to talk about fantasy fiction. My first novel was published last summer. It's called Weiße Lichter in German. In English it would be White Lights, and it doesn't exist in English yet. I hope to translate it into English in the next few months, and I hope also to read a few excerpts to you in English later this year. That's what I'm doing. The focus, as I said, of this channel will be fantasy fiction, but I want to delve into other fields as well, because when you write fiction, like fantasy fiction, it's natural to look into fields like history, philosophy, psychology, perhaps archaeology, and mythology, and of course the history of literature in general. And I would like to address a few of these topics in these videos, starting today with a writer who has been very influential on my own writing, Jrr Tolkien, specifically in this video on philosophy in The Lord of the Rings. Centering on this book, The Lord of the Rings and Philosophy, edited by Gregory Basham and Eric Bronson from the year 2003. It was published shortly after the movies by Peter Jackson, of course. As you can see, we have the wizard Gandalf here on the cover picture, a picture from the movie. And I thought this was interesting because Tolkien is clearly the most influential writer on my own writing. I read The Lord of the Rings 5 times as a child and as a teenager, and then once again when I was 20 years old in the English original for the first time. And already when I read it as a teenager, say the 5th time at least, I wasn't a real Tolkien fan anymore. The good-bad dichotomy was a little bit too simplistic to me, and the characters seemed fairly flat, most of them, possibly with the exception of Sam, who is said to be a picture of the writer himself. And in my late teens I stopped reading fantasy. Of course I read a lot of other writers like C.S. Lewis, Ursula K. Le Guin, Stephen R. Donaldson, Susan Cooper, and many others. But I got tired of fantasy in my late teens, and when I read Tolkien again, The Lord of the Rings again, it was mainly to see how I would take it now, what impression it would have on me, and I enjoyed it. But what I enjoyed were mainly the descriptions of nature, which I thought were very beautiful, not so much the real story. And from my late teens, I hardly read any fantasy anymore for the next 20 years or more, until I started writing myself again. I wrote a lot of fantasy, of course, as a child and as a teenager, until I was about 20 years old. And then I stopped writing, and then I started again 4.5 years ago. And then I started reading fantasy again, because when I started to write, I immediately started to write fantasy. Strangely enough, I wanted to write other things. I tried my hands on a thriller, and it turned out to become a fantasy novel as well, which is this one, as I showed you, White Lights, which is the first volume in a new fantasy series. So apparently I haven't been able to get away from fantasy, or I was drawn back into it by my interest in fairy tales, which I loved as a child, in history, mythology, and philosophy, psychology, and a lot of other things. And because I stopped reading fantasy as a teenager, and Tolkien was the #1 influence on my writing as a child and as a teenager, I was reluctant to read anything even about Tolkien again. So I hesitated quite a bit before I picked up this book, The Lord of the Rings and Philosophy. But eventually I read it, and I'm glad I did, because it's a very interesting read. It's a very light read. It's very funny, entertaining, but it also makes you think, because there are philosophical topics in Tolkien's works, and I overlooked them myself as a teenager, although I studied philosophy later at the university. But I never thought about Tolkien as a philosopher until I read this book, actually. I was aware of the environmental problem in Tolkien's works, and it's important. As a teenager, I also read a biography of Tolkien. I read an edition of his letters. So I was aware of this topic, and the fact that Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, as well as Frank Herbert's Dune, influenced the young environmental movement in the 60s. But I never saw him as a philosopher until now. So this book really opened my eyes, and I would like to delve into a few of these topics now with you, and I hope it will be an interesting journey. To this day, The Lord of the Rings has been my strongest reading experience. Without it, I would probably not have become a novelist myself. Almost everything I wrote as a child and as a teenager belonged to the fantasy genre, and so does most of what I've written during the last 4.5 years, after I started writing again. Frodo and Sam, Aragorn, Gollum, and not the least the Black Riders made me a fantasy writer. When I tried my hands on other things like SF, thrillers, horror stories, or mainstream realism, most of the time the result was not very impressive. My first published novel, White Lights, began as a thriller, but soon developed a life of its own and turned into the first volume of a fantasy series. But Tolkien was part of my past, like a house in which you spent your childhood and which you hesitate to enter again as an adult. Finally, I did read Gregory Basham's and Eric Bronson's The Lord of the Rings and Philosophy, one book to rule them all, after having read and greatly enjoyed Sherlock Holmes and Philosophy, The Footprints of a Gigantic Mind, edited by Joseph Steiff in the same series. The book on the philosophy of The Lord of the Rings is a slim volume of 240 pages and an easy read. No previous knowledge of philosophy is needed, and the contributions by the 17 authors are all informative and entertaining. But why care about philosophical themes in fiction? If you're interested in philosophy, you read Plato, Kant, or Nietzsche, right? The problem is that we need examples to relate philosophical arguments to our experienced reality. This is true not just for ethics and political philosophy, but also for aesthetics, epistemology, that is, the theory of knowledge, and metaphysics. For example, questions like freedom of will and the meaning of life. Academic philosophers, who almost always write for other academic philosophers, tend to create their own examples to illustrate their arguments. In most cases, these narrative contexts have very little, if anything, to do with real-life situations, since they fail to do justice to the complexity of human psychology. This makes a lot of the philosophical discussion in academia seem unrealistic and shallow. Few philosophers make use of fiction in their analysis. One of those who do is Martha C. Nussbaum. I had the opportunity to attend a few of her lectures on the philosophy of emotions in the 1990s, in which she discussed, for example, Henry James. However, she remains an exception. This is astonishing, especially since several of the greatest thinkers of all time were also great prose writers. Plato, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche immediately come to mind, as well as the existential thinkers of the 20th century. Plato developed his philosophy in dialogues, where the characters defend different philosophical positions, and he often makes use of metaphors and myths. Kierkegaard wanted to do something similar, perhaps to compete with Plato, and he too speaks through different fictional characters. And Nietzsche, who didn't like Plato and who didn't know Kierkegaard, not only has the Persian prophet Zoroaster proclaimed Nietzsche's own philosophy in poetic images. Again and again, he also makes use of narration and metaphors in his aphorisms. Tolkien too offers us a philosophy, not by way of argument, but by examples. The Lord of the Rings is a story about the relationship between power and morals. For Tolkien, unlimited power is incompatible with respecting the wishes and needs of others. The story centers around the choice between the two. Everyone has a free will, and we are therefore fully responsible for our actions. The Lord of the Rings and philosophy compares the One Ring with the Ring of Gyges in Plato's Republic. Interestingly, the Ring of Gyges too makes its bearer invisible, which gives him great power. The shepherd Gyges uses it to make himself king, thereby seducing the queen and killing the former king. Plato now claims that absolute power not only corrupts, it also makes a fulfilled life impossible. Tolkien shows us that this is true. Greed makes you empty inside, the case of Gollum. Power just for the sake of power finally makes you want to destroy the world, making it as empty as you yourself are, the case of Sauron. Resisting one's wish for power requires accepting one's limitations, instead of hiding behind an idealized self-image and making unrealistic demands on the world around you, the case of Sam. We can resist the wish for power, but it has its price, since we may have to give up our influence as well as external goods, the case of Galadriel. But what we gain is infinitely much more valuable. Not wanting, just giving, makes for a happy life, the case of Bombadil. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien distinguishes between magic and enchantment. Magic symbolizes dominance, for example in the form of voice magic, the case of Saruman. Enchantment means being able to spread joy by simple means like fireworks, the case of Gandalf. Opening oneself to enchantment, like the hobbits do, makes for a rich experience, even as adults, and helps us not to lose ourselves in greed and fetishism. Reading The Lord of the Rings brings us back the sense of wonder that we had as children, and we are able to return to our own world in a spirit of thankfulness for the gift of life. The hobbits are our models in their Epicurean love for the small enjoyments of life and in their Aristotelian expertise in friendship, but also in the Nietzschean acceptance of danger and pain when necessary. And they never completely give up hope. They affirm life and are able to enjoy the beauty of nature even in the harshest of conditions. What then do the magic rings symbolize? They hold time, and thus the aging of the wearer and ultimately of his land, relieving us of our fear of death. And they give the power to influence others, to heal as well as to dominate. Are they to be seen as a metaphor for modern industrial technology? Technology provides us with the means to save lives and to prolong it, but as well with means of control and weapons of mass destruction. The Lord of the Rings informs us of the danger of giving power to external objects. Are certain kinds of research to be restricted, like genetics or nanotechnology? Tolkien's contemporary Karl Jaspers warned us of the danger of uncritically embracing technology, since technology may isolate us from our past and thus prevent us from knowing ourselves. Marillion, The Lord of the Rings is a Christian work. It defends values like pity, love, and self-sacrifice, the belief in providence, and an Augustinian interpretation of the problem of evil. According to St. Augustine, evil is simply lack of good. The good is a positive force, evil is nothingness, like the ringwraiths, who lack a visible form, and the eye of Sauron, which is described as a window to nothingness. No living being is completely evil. Even Sauron and his predecessor Melkor were once good spirits. Evil means disturbing the divine order because you demand more than your share, starting with Melkor's rebellion before the creation of the world. Evil cannot exist without good, like chaos depends on order, but good is not dependent on evil. For Tolkien, the epoch in which he lived was deeply destructive. Its blind belief in progression had led to the destruction of the environment, symbolized by the workings of Sauron and Saruman. Tolkien's alternative was the wisdom of Gandalf and the hobbits. Like Ents, we are the stewards of a very old world, and we have great responsibility. With The Lord of the Rings, his gift to humanity, Tolkien invites us to open ourselves to a bigger perspective than our own short lives. Jrr Tolkien will have much to say to future generations of readers.